In this, the third of our programs on space science, we ask the question, what should Britain's space policy be? Mr. Thornycroft, the Minister of Aviation, is at this moment concluding talks on a joint European space project. In Space 1 and Space 2, we sketched in for you the facts of life in outer space. We refresh your memory.
The rocket began in ancient China, and it was Wang Hu who first attempted to use it for flight. But it was 1,000 years later that the first effective rocket left its launching pad. After experiments in Russia and America between the wars, it was the Germans with their notorious V-2 who built the basis of the modern satellite launchers. On the 4th of October 1957, the first Sputnik was put into orbit. And from then on, the Russians and Americans pressed their military weapons into the peaceful race into space.
3, 2, 1.
Instruments of unprecedented complexity were sent up to collect scientific data which would have been unobtainable by other means. But instruments were not enough, and up went the livestock to prepare the way for manned spaceflight. And this is the next eagerly awaited step, to put a Patriot into orbit. This would undoubtedly be a major victory in the Cold War. But there are more profitable, if less spectacular, aspects of the space program. In our first program, Space 1, Geoffrey Pardo explained how a British communication satellite system could make a profit of £500 million over the first 20 years using British experience and materials. Now, British experience in rocketry has been quite considerable since the war. But our other scientists haven't really had a chance to do of their best. One who has is Professor Lovell. And when I went up to Jodrell Bank to see him, I asked him whether he thought that a British space program would be really worthwhile.
I think that unless we have our own space program, and by our own space program I don't mean merely instrumenting other people's satellites, but having our own launching vehicles, then I think that we should become very low grade in the scientific world within the next 2 or 3 decades. The whole of the space research which is being carried out in America and in Russia is opening up vast new fields of scientific endeavor, and even now we're only at the beginning of this. I think that if we don't engage in our own space program, then our industry will lose the stimulus to develop new techniques and new products, and our young people will feel that they have to go to the United States in increasing numbers because they will be missing out on an extremely important branch of science.
And yet, Professor, a remarkable number of astronomers, scientists of all kinds, are hostile to a British space program, and feel that to spend so much money on this particular branch of science, more than on all the other branches put together, unbalances the structure of science in this country.
I think it's an interesting point. I think that astronomers, and by the way, not only in this country, but oddly enough in America as well, do tend to be somewhat hostile to space research. This, I think, is not difficult to understand. Astronomers have had a tremendous struggle, and so have we, to get relatively small amounts of money to build optical telescopes and radio telescopes. And naturally, if you see the cost of a 200-inch Palomar telescope or a Jodrell Bank telescope just blowing up on the launching pad, then one tends to feel rather sad about it and become hostile. But this, you see, is rare. The trouble really is that not enough money is being spent on ordinary astronomy and other science. And this is what makes me rather sad. The people who are hostile to space science, they should be hostile to the lack of expenditure of money in their own sciences and other research. The argument is being used the wrong way.
And they want more money for everyone, not less for some.
Of course, and I think the other point that's being missed by these people is that space research has already opened and will certainly continue to open vast new fields of endeavour. It's sometimes argued, you see, that more money ought to go into the biological or medical sciences. Well, why don't people appreciate that the investigations in space in the next 10 years are almost certainly going to open up entirely new avenues for space biology and space medicine?
The man who will be responsible for Britain's space program is the Minister for Science, Lord Hailsham. Barry Westwood put to him the questions which scientists and engineers throughout the country are asking.
Lord Hailsham, Professor Lovell has said that unless Britain has its own space program, and he defined that as meaning our own launching vehicle, we would, within the next 2 decades, become a very low-grade science power. Do you agree with this?
I don't think it depends on whether we have our own large launching vehicle at all. I think what our prestige as a scientific power depends upon is whether we do the right things scientifically in the right way, and I don't think that necessarily depends on the possession of a launcher.
And is our space program going to continue on this very limited basis indefinitely?
Our space program is only at the moment geared to the next 3 or 4 years, which is the beginning. What happens after that must depend upon the result of the present talks to a very great extent. But quite clearly we're not going to stop. Our scientists will go on playing their part in space. It's a question of what the organization will be.
How important is space science relative to the other sciences?
I think very important indeed. It is, of course, only a part of the physical sciences, but it has an influence on a great number of them. It's closely related to other physical problems like the cosmic rays, which of course ties up with high-energy physics and nuclear physics. It's very closely tied up with astronomy. It has a very wide bearing on weather and the measurement and exploration of the Earth and its atmosphere. And of course it may, as you were saying a moment ago, have very important repercussions on communications. So I would say it was very important indeed.
Would you say that it is in fact in the immediate future the most important of the sciences?
No.
It must take its place in the queue with the others?
I don't think there is a queue. I don't think there's a queue at all. How could there be a queue?
I was meaning really financially.
Yes, but I still don't think there's a queue. How could there be a queue, for instance, between breeding a new kind of cow, cancer research, and whether you put up a satellite into space?
Well, presumably there must be some decision somewhere as to how you allocate the available funds.
Not in that way at all. I just don't see how you could begin to do so. The Medical Research Council demands funds for medical research and has quite a separate negotiation with the financial authorities to that of the various people who are interested in space. And similarly, the agricultural ones are quite independent. And the Atomic Energy Authority is independent again. I'm the friend of all at court. They are my responsibilities. But the one thing I should always refuse to do would be to discuss space science in relation to cancer research. It seems to be a meaningless discussion.
So the critics of space science who say that we shouldn't spend money on this because we should be spending that money on something else are really on the wrong line.
Well, they're on the wrong line if they suggest that the choice is between something in the biological sciences or space science, but they're not necessarily on the wrong line if they compare the actual things which the scientists who would be doing space scientists would be doing, but they wouldn't be going suddenly to discuss biology or something like that. They'd be doing some other form of physics.
Yes, there's no question of an overall science budget.
I hope not. I mean, it would be meaningless if there were. It's a thing I should always protest against.
Lord Hailsham, you are Minister for Science, although in fact there is no Ministry of Science. I believe you have a very small department.
A very small department, I hope. We could all get into an omnibus.
Is this, in 1960, the right attitude to science?
Yes, I hope so. Otherwise I shouldn't be here.
But wouldn't you like a proper ministry with more responsibility and more
I don't know why you think my ministry is improper.
Well, as a ministry, it's non-existent, isn't it?
I've got a department of about 56 people, and they do the job which they're asked to do, and I think they wouldn't do it better by being more numerous.
During these programs, we have raised a great number of questions, and I confess that I didn't feel I got very many answers to them from Viscount Hailsham. However, I have with me tonight 4 experts from whom I hope we're going to get more definite answers as to just what Britain should do. Sitting immediately on my right is Sir Harry Massey, himself a physicist, chairman of the Royal Society's Committee for Space Research, and the gentleman who, a short while ago, made a deal with the Americans for them to put up our satellites on their rockets. On my left, I have Geoffrey Pardoe, whom you've met before. He's de Havilland, and he is perhaps one of the leading space technologists in the country today. And then I have 2 members of the all-party Parliamentary Space Committee. These 2 gentlemen are both officers of that committee and 2 of the leading lights. They are David Price, Conservative MP for Eastleigh, and on my left, Woodrow Wyatt, Labour MP for Bosworth. So, Harry, I think it's fair to ask you, as the chairman of this Committee for Space Research, to tell us briefly what is Britain's present space programme.
Yes, well, I think I'd better make it clear in replying to this that I shall be speaking on behalf of the pure science programme, the study of the high atmosphere, the sun, the stars, and so on, by using rocket vehicles and satellite vehicles. Now, Britain has had for quite some time a programme of studying the high atmosphere with rockets, and is continuing to do so using the Woomera rocket range in Australia. And in addition to this, as has been mentioned, we have arrangements with the United States whereby they are launching instruments for us, instruments which we ourselves have chosen and are designing and will construct, in satellites, three off in the first instance, which will be really very substantial scientific satellites. In addition to this, we are also building up a close cooperation with Europe in this field of space science. We have already arranged with them to discuss the setting up of a possible organization for cooperation. On the other hand, as far as the pure science is concerned, of course, we do rely on vehicles other than, apart from the rockets for the Woomera work, we do rely on American launching vehicles.
Various points seem to rise out of that. I think the first one is the obvious omission of any question of putting a man or animals into space. Do we feel that this is a material omission at this stage? Woodrow Wyatt?
Well, I think that in your last programme, if I may say so, you slightly exaggerated the importance of putting a man into space as being one of the first objects of the space research programme.
Although, in fact, it's the thing upon which the Americans and the Russians are both spending a great deal of their endeavour at the moment, isn't it?
Yes, I think they're doing that for reasons of national prestige, rather than the immediate practical result. And I'd put far ahead of that working out a system of communication satellites, or putting up a reconnaissance satellite which could observe everything going on all over the world, which could be used in connection, say, with a disarmament agreement, and things of that kind. I don't think we had to put a man up into space straight away.
I think, in fact, that putting a man into space, one can visualise a need for doing this at some time later on. But there are these many things to be done, and I'd like to emphasise this wide range of applications, some of which have been mentioned, scientific, military, and civil. And I think we certainly want to have in mind these very, very good probabilities of civil applications from communication and navigation networks.
So at the moment we're not much concerned by Britain's lack of interest at this stage in putting a man or animals into space.
Don't find about that at all.
No. How about the other omission from Britain's programme, which is at the moment any question of a launching vehicle of our own? Do we feel the same way about this, that this doesn't matter at this stage?
I feel very strongly it does matter. I believe it matters for various reasons. One, not very tangible perhaps, but very important, and that is that by developing the rocket vehicles, which will give us the means of putting this equipment into space, we do learn a tremendous amount we gain a lot of experience which is fed back into many branches of industry, which in turn affect domestic equipment indirectly. We've experienced this already in developing Blue Streak for the last 5 years, and we've seen just how important this can be. And the second point concerning the need to develop our own vehicles is the commercial aspect of this space work. If we, and I sincerely hope we do, go into a commercial program, or a program which includes the commercial communication satellite systems, we must not be vulnerable to the supply, or lack of supply, of these rockets from presumably America, and perhaps just as important, the difficulties of getting the right priorities to launch these rockets if they are to be fired from American ranges.
So, Harry, when you were in America negotiating the use of scout rockets to put by satellites,
Yes.
did you get any impression as to whether the Americans would give us free access to any rocket of any capacity we may desire to do commercial jobs and so on?
Well, I didn't really get much impression at all on the commercial side. I was not over there to discuss that. It is fair to say that on the scientific side, they're extremely cooperative, and our relations with them have been extremely good all the time. But the commercial side is, of course, a different thing altogether for the purely scientific side, and I think that in judging whether Britain should develop launching vehicles herself, one must judge very much on these kind of applications, because the sums one has to invest are very large, and if there are commercial applications, then these must very much determine the lines one should follow. I don't think you could rely on another country to provide vehicles.
David Price, what do you feel about this question of a vehicle? Should we use American vehicles?
Well, I think there are obvious advantages on the short time scale of doing the sort of experiments that Sir Harry has succeeded in initiating. But I think from the British point of view, I think it's essential, with the technology we've got behind us, that we should have our own vehicle. Now, if we'd done nothing up to now and we were starting from the beginning, then I think there might be strong arguments of saying merely we should content ourselves with buying from the Americans, accepting that one at best would be a second-class power in this. But in view of the fact we've spent a very large sum of money already on the Blue Streak and Black Knight, and remember Black Knight has been a great success. It's the only rocket, to my knowledge, that has had a 100% success record. We then had on the sounding rockets work we've done in Woomera on smaller rockets. Now, I believe that the government have got to make a decision jolly soon, because we will lose on the time scale the advantage we have at the moment. Because remember this, all the evidence is that Blue Streak, which was stopped as a military vehicle for sound military reasons, because it was a fixed-site vehicle, those disadvantages do not apply for the civil use. On the contrary, there is every evidence that Blue Streak will provide the admirable launching vehicle for the sort of work, both exploiting commercially on a satellite communication system, and also the work that Sir Harry and the pure scientists wish to conduct.
But I think this is one of the most important problems that faces Britain today. I think our whole future as a competitive export nation is tied up with it, because this is a wide new field of technological development, and if we miss out on it, we've had it. Now, I think that what Sir Harry said is all very well about his scientific program of pure research and so forth, but it's rather like a scientist who's very keen on catching butterflies, saying, now, the motor car's the most marvellous thing because I should be able to catch up with fast-moving butterflies, as though this was the only use of a motor car, which we obviously know it isn't. And I think what's gone wrong here is that the government is taking a frivolous attitude towards it. I mean, we just heard Lord Hailsham talking rot about what a marvellous ministry he's got of science because he can get them all into an omnibus. Well, he should have been ashamed to say a thing like that, not proud of it. And here the Americans and the Russians are spending millions upon millions in this field because they know that by doing so they can put up, if you like, a series of communication satellites. I mean, the Bell Telephone Company of America have worked out a scheme by which for £70 million capital outlay, you can make a return of £1,000 million a year on all these transoceanic calls that will be made. And we're just frivoling about with the thing. We're not taking it seriously. Now, I won't altogether blame the government because I think in the opposition party, too, people are not taking this seriously. I mean, for example, we mentioned our all-party Space Research Committee earlier. We held a great symposium in the House of Commons only a week or so ago. We had the greatest experts in the land with films, and we secularised individually every member of Parliament, both in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and 12 came. Well, this is the importance that the British nation attaches to this new field.
12 only?
Yes. Can I take up Woodrow Wyatt there when he used the word frivolous about Lord Hailsham's attitude? I don't believe it's frivolous. I do agree with him. I think it represents the current view of the British people. I disagree profoundly with what Lord Hailsham said in his interview when he suggested that there was no queue for government resources. He ought to have talked with the Chancellor's Exchequer. And this is part of my complaint, is that we're not getting our priorities right. And all that we here who are keen on space want could be containable from the taxpayer's point of view, within half the amount of the taxpayer's money we spend each year on the egg subsidy. And
yeah,
which is more important?
But don't even worry about the egg subsidy. Here is something where you can actually make a profit for the taxpayer. Right. And the post office is sitting doing absolutely nothing about this. When after all, this nation laid all the first submarine cables in the world. We were ahead of everybody in this, and we're doing nothing at all about the communication satellites, which could reap this country a terrific
Woodrow, we're
profit.
doing more than that. We're in danger of wasting the taxpayers' money, because at the last Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference, we are committed in the Commonwealth to doing a World Commonwealth link with cable, which, if the evidence that we've seen in these three programs is true, the thing will be obsolete now, out of date, before it's ever laid.
I don't think that's the right attitude at all towards this. This space business is far, far larger than most people seem to visualize. In fact, I was interested in Lord Hailsham's remark about the whole of his ministry going into the bus. I am appalled at the thought that the size of a busload of technicians is considering the future of space for this country.
I don't
considering many
think
other things besides.
Yes, I don't think this is so. I'll be quite honest, my impression when I went to see Lord Hailsham was that it's difficult to know just what they are considering or what they're supposed to consider. I would hesitate to use the word frivolous, but I have found with Lord Hailsham and indeed with every other person in the government or in a position of responsibility whom we've approached, a desire to be evasive. You cannot find out who is responsible for what.
Okay, there's another point about all this. A year ago, the British Interplanetary Society and myself, we sent a memorandum to the Prime Minister. We saw Lord Hailsham, who said, can you produce some arguments for the commercial profitability of space research? We produced them. They're remarkably ill-informed. Most of his information has come from us anyway. And yet we're still dithering about doing absolutely nothing at all.
Price, you, I know, have gone in some detail into the question of cooperation with Europe and other countries. What, in fact, should we do here? Should we go into this alone, or should we go in with Europe and the Commonwealth?
My own view is that in the first instance we should consider doing it alone. I qualify that by saying when we talk of ourselves, we also mean the Australians, because of the heavy commitment, both moral and financial, to Woomera. But I feel so passionately that Britain's future depends upon our being involved in space, that if the powers that be, the British electorate, the Gallup polls, the lot, won't take what is involved doing it alone, I want to cooperate then, I'm willing to cooperate with other nations who are in the same sort of dilemma as we are. And those are the leading European ones.
Well, would you agree, though, that we ought to go ahead with the development of the Blue Streak as the satellite launcher, and if the Europeans want to come in afterwards, fine, it all helps towards a European cooperation. But we ought not to wait upon Europe. I mean, we've got a thing we can do ourselves. We don't have to wait for them, do we?
Yes, I'd agree with you. I'd go further. You see, we've been talking about, during this program, on a world communication satellite system. Now, it might be, in the end, from a point of view of an orderly world, it would be better if we eventually did that with the Americans. But one thing I'm quite certain of, if we're to get reasonable terms as even junior partner with the Americans, we've got to start doing it ourselves. You'll recall in the nuclear field, we've only been able to get cooperation with the Americans when we showed that we were capable of developing our own atomic and hydrogen bombs.
Yes. May I say something here? There's one point I think that we are a little in danger of forgetting. And that is science as such, pure science, has been rather lightly brushed aside as similar to butterfly chasing. I might point out that almost everything that has evolved here has resulted from research in pure science.
Yes.
And we must not get so much in our mind that communications is a thing to go for that we forget the pure science. Because from the pure science, I think that there may come even more remarkable important applications.
I think the pure science is a long-term basis. It will never end, and it's vitally important. I try and stress communication side because until more recently it's tended to be ignored.
Yes, quite.
I merely want to emphasize the very broad, wide spectrum of activity in space, part of which can be remunerative and therefore different from military
Exactly. I think the important...
So, Harry, would you accept that this, as a basic suggestion, that pure science should go up as the non-paying guest, as it were, on commercial usage?
Well, no, I wouldn't like to see it in that situation, quite. I think that it should be, in its own right, it should be regarded as an investment of where you cannot estimate the amount you're going to get out of it.
Certainly.
And that you must keep it in the forefront because it potentially may produce much more than anything else that one is doing.
But you would agree that commercial usage should go along simultaneously?
Yes, I've never for one moment suggested that there aren't applications immediately. I think in commercial applications of the communication side are very well worth serious consideration and should be looked into very carefully. and gone ahead with if it looks at all promising. And there are, of course, other possibilities of
I didn't mean to run down the catching of butterflies, which I think is terribly important. But I do think that this country, if it's to exist, must keep up a competitive position in the world, scientifically and technologically. And we can't do it if we rely upon the Americans, for example, to make the launches for communication satellites and put them up, and then we simply become a high-paying hirer of these things instead of making... We didn't do this with submarine.
To bear out your argument, in the second program that we saw, we were given the figure that there are 20,000 private firms in America doing subcontracting work to the American space program.
That's the measure of the stimulus which one gets from doing a
Yes.
broad program of vehicles and satellites.
I mean, where would radar be in this country if it hadn't been for the R&D work done during the war?
Can I just, to bring this to a close, which I'm afraid I must do, say, what can we, meaning the ordinary citizens in the country, do about this? Because it does look as though things are in a pretty pitiful state.
Well, may I say that you yourself, by putting on these programs, have performed a national service. They're first-class programs in awakening public interest to what is going on and the possibilities. The trouble with this country, in my view, is it's saturated with a soggy complacency. We think everything's going to be all right forever without any effort. It will not be. We're living in a fierce, jungle, competitive world. And we've got to do these things even though it costs us a bit at the time, because we've got to put our money out and hope for the return. And we can do it. We've got the best scientists in the world, and they can do more with less money than any scientists anywhere.
Woodrow Wyatt's quite right. We call ourselves the second Elizabethan. Very few of us could live for a week in the first Elizabethan age. And we've got to care about pioneering in the way that our ancestors did in the first Elizabeth's reign.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, it emerges that we're satisfied that scientific research must go on. We're also pretty well agreed that we must have a decent launching vehicle capable of exploiting commercial usage as well. In the long run, it comes to you. It's up to you to see that your government and your parliament does something, at any rate, to consider this vital issue.